What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. So I'm still not exactly sure what to make of Terence Crawford's performance against Kell Brook. On one hand, he struggled in the first 3 rounds. I had him losing at least 2 of those 3 rounds, as most did. But it seemed like when he figured it out pretty quickly and stopped a otherwise formerly durable Kell Brook. Everything but Kell Brook's face, right? His eye area has seemed to be durable. He went up and did the unthinkable in fighting, challenging Triple G. It ended up in TKO loss, and then he ended up coming down to defend his IBF title and then lost that in a very, very good fight with Errol Spence Jr. So everybody was wondering what Kell Brook had left. Some thought that he was going to make this an even fight. Some were picking him to win, but most were picking Terence Bud Crawford, and many were picking him to win via stoppage. He got that stoppage, but this wasn't a dominant performance. When people say that he won in dominating fashion over Kell Brook, I look at dominating as being when you win round 2, 3, 4, 5, and the guy just has no answer for you. This was the type of win where, luckily for Terence Crawford, he had an answer to Kell Brook's advantages, which is nothing to gloss over. That is an incredible thing to do. And some people, were even confused by the way that Kell Brook got stopped. It looked like it was a punch that Crawford didn't have full leverage in. Almost like a Anderson Silva versus Forrest Griffin step back jab while Forrest Griffin is coming at him. And Kell Brook was setting up to throw a straight right hand, because that's how you want to counter a southpaw, or in the case of Crawford, somebody who's switching to southpaw after spending the first 2 rounds in orthodox. The 3rd round involved Crawford making the switch from orthodox to southpaw, and then Kell Brook kind of being thrown off his game a little bit, where the 3rd round was a lot tougher to call, a lot more competitive than the first 2 rounds, which Kell Brook was controlling more or less with his jab. Crisp jab. So Crawford makes the adjustment in the 3rd round. It's a pretty even round, and then closes the show in the 4th round as Kell Brook does what he's supposed to when the guy switches to southpaw, which is to throw the right lead if you're talented enough to do so. And historically, Kell Brook has been talented enough to throw that lead right hand and connect. It caught Errol Spence off guard for the first several rounds of their fight. It was a right lead, and he was stealing on him. He was stealing on Errol Spence. Errol Spence dug in and gave Kell Brook hell over, the course of the fight, but Kell Brook's got a fast and hard right hand. So I think that Kell was saying, oh shoot, this might play perfectly into my right hand, but what he didn't know was that, or wasn't cognizant in that moment of, was that Terence Crawford, arguably most effective and dangerous punch, might be from the southpaw stance, that check right hook from the southpaw stance. And Kell Brook looked like he kind of walked right into it, because it was delivered before he could deliver that right hand lead. While the physics of that might explain why Kell Brook was so off balance, plus the fact that you could tell he clearly didn't see that punch coming. His eyes were thrown off when that punch landed. He did not see that right hand was so close to his head as Crawford was measuring distance. He had the right halfway out there, where it was almost like maybe 6 to 9 inches away from Kell Brook's face, and Kell Brook is setting up to then launch the right hand, and Crawford just turns that right hand over, and it kind of like, maybe knuckle, because it looked like the punch was pushed up into Brook's face, almost like it was a push punch, but the reaction to it was Kell Brook's legs almost going Zab Judah, legs getting crossed up as he runs into the ropes and almost falls through the ropes. So he was clearly, or at least apparently, pretty jacked up. I'm not going to fall into the conspiracy that some hold that this was somehow a flop or a dive or not an authentic knockout. I give I give Kell Brook's fighting spirit too much benefit of the doubt to even entertain that. Although the payout here was pretty nice for Kell. But I think that Kell Brook is a competitor, a true competitor, and I think that he did get hit cleanly with a punch that he didn't see. But what do you make of that going forward and trying to assess Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence? Well, Errol Spence might have his hands full with Danny Garcia next month. In my preview video there, I actually picked Danny Garcia to win that fight, basically because I'm betting against the likelihood that somebody could be involved in such a devastating style of car accident, have that type of inactivity and layoff, and then come back against an opponent as dangerous as Danny Garcia and be their 100% best self. That's what Errol Spence is asking of himself in choosing an opponent like Garcia. And right now, I almost think that it would be a disrespect to Danny Garcia to then still bet against Garcia under those conditions. But I don't know, man. Like, from what I'm hearing coming out of the Spence side and the fact that he looks like he might really be, truly be on track. We'll see where his timing is, where his durability, his punch resistance, all these different things are when he actually fights Garcia. But I'm almost like thinking about switching that bet to saying, maybe Errol Spence really is that special. And maybe Danny Garcia really is just under being an A+ fighter and is perhaps a low A minus level elite fighter. You know what I mean? I think he was elite A+ at 140, but at 147, maybe just a notch under that. And he's only lost fights by like 1 round here versus Keith Thurman, and 1 round or 2 rounds here versus Sean Porter. You know what I mean? Nobody's blown Danny Garcia out or even won by a like super convincing decision. In fact, if anybody did do that, I would have said it was Mauricio Herrera who they actually gave the decision to Danny Garcia to or against. But looking at Bud Crawford versus Spence, it's like, if Spence is 100%, if he could return to true Errol Spence, the guy who knocked out Chris Algieri, knocked out Leonard Bundu, stopped Lamont Peterson, stopped Kell Brook for his title, beat Sean Porter via close decision, with the difference being a late round knockdown for Errol Spence. If we have 100% Errol Spence here, which people say that he's actually more dedicated now in light of this accident and the epiphany that he had through that experience than he was, when he was on top for a few years, because his dedication to the craft allegedly was kind of dwindling, where he was partying a little bit more. We could tell by the way he was driving at the time of the accident that he was living it up a bit, but it sounds like he's now back to being 100% devoted to the sport. And if that actually allows him to exceed where we've seen him in the past, that would be bad news for any opponent at 147. I would certainly favor him there over Terence Crawford. But man, there's something special about what Crawford's doing in there. The fact that his last several fights, even after moving up to 147, have all been ending via knockout or TKO. Once Terence Crawford starts putting hands on people, it's not very long before they're out of there. Some people give him a stylistic matchup problem, like David Benavidez' smaller brother, or versus Yuriorkis Gamboa, where Gamboa hurt Crawford a couple times in the early and middle rounds. There have been people who have given Terence Crawford a bit of problem. And Errol Spence, to me, is about as elite as they come at 147. He's so damn strong, hits so hard, and when he wants to, he can also box his ass off. I was blown away, not that he beat Mikey Garcia, but by the way that he beat Mikey Garcia. The outcome I didn't expect was that he was going to actually fight off his back foot and that Garcia was going to be totally unable to collapse the pocket against Spence, who is the type of guy who you only want to collapse the pocket at your own peril. Only the Sean Porters and people like that seem to be able to be durable enough to survive in the pocket with Errol Spence. And Errol Spence chose to fight Mikey Garcia at the end of a jab. He had Mikey Garcia looking like Deontay Wilder made Bermane Stiverne look, not in the knockout rematch, but in their first fight like 5 years ago when Wilder won his WBC